Biggest gamble then of his political career, that is France's President Emmanuel Macron has called early legislative elections for less than 3 weeks' time as he tries to combat the surge of the far right. As European election results show the party of Marine Le Pen is projected to win twice as many votes as any other party, Macron saying he could not carry on as if nothing had happened. He'll aim to keep that right surge at bay. The fear, though, that whilst it is highly unlikely to lead to a far-right majority in the French parliament, they will make gains, making it, well, perhaps more fractious and the country more impossible to govern. It leaves France's politicians now scrambling as well to decide how they will tackle these elections, with the possibility of them forming groups with rival parties to try to win as many seats as possible. Well, let's begin with this report then from Shirley Sitbon.
President Emmanuel Macron had barely ended his statement dissolving the National Assembly that political leaders announced their strategy. On the left side of the political spectrum, several MPs said there is no other choice but to unite forces.
The left must unite. We have to stop the bullshit so we can face the far right.
But the leader of this MP's own far-left France Unbowed party rejects the idea of unifying the left.
What's the use of bleating together? Unity, unity, I'm afraid. What would be the basis for this? What would be the purpose?
Left-wing parties agreed to join forces 2 years ago ahead of parliamentary elections, but the alliance splintered over the war in Gaza. And acrimony continued during the EU elections, with a socialist candidate the main target of an aggressive France Unbowed party campaign. Finding common ground for the snap elections will be difficult.
This alliance will be based on an ideological line that is social, environmental and deeply attached to the dignity of public debate, without outbursts or violence.
While the left prepares to face off with the far right, President Macron's party hopes to seal an alliance with the right, Les Républicains party, whose MPs are also being wooed by the national rally. Les Républicains party has refused any form of alliance.
France needs the right, the Republican right, and we will be there on election day.
And the date set by the French president for the first round of voting is 3 weeks away on June 30th.
Well, let's analyse then all the latest results for you. For now, I'm joined by French modern history expert and lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London, Andrew Smith. Andrew, great to have you with us on the programme today. Let's start here in France then. I mean, there had been rumours, hadn't there, that Macron might do this if the polls came to be true and dissolve Parliament. Most people were dismissing those rumours, and then he went ahead and did it.
Yeah, something of a surprise last night. I think some people thought that there was likely to be dissolution before 2027, but I don't think you could find many people who would have gambled on it being before the Olympics. You know, as they used to say on the TV show, I think Humphrey Appleby used to advise his minister that he was brave if he was doing something that was going to lose votes, courageous if he was going to do something that would lose an election. But I think he'd be nominating Macron for the Croix de Guerre at this rate. It is a huge gamble, and it really, really puts the starting pistol has been fired for a very quick election as well. And even the speed at which this happens is going to play into changing some of the dynamics which are actually going on. We heard there, of course, about the race to form some kind of left-wing alliance to rebuild NUPES. And of course, we know the biggest obstacle to that is Mélenchon, the creator of the France Insoumise. Instead, we've heard from people like François Ruffin, even Olivier Faure at the head of the Socialist Party, who are much more keen to try and put something together. But I think it's Friday that people have the deadline to actually register candidates. So this is really, really quick stuff, and it's caught a lot of people on the hop. But of course, that's part of the calculation. This has been a small team working on it in the Élysée. They reckon about 10 people, 10 advisors working on this, close to some of the people in the Sarkozy camp, people like Gérald Darmanin. And this has really caught a lot of people by surprise. I think almost everyone has been caught surprised by the speed at which this has been called.
I've heard so many different rumours and theories about why he might have done it. What do you think? What's your view?
Well, I mean, it's tough, isn't it? Because you have to imagine Macron is not a man of small ambition or self-regard. This looks like he is campaigning for an election that he thinks his party can win. So we take that as a starting kind of idea. He surely is gambling that, on the first hand, he doesn't think the left will be able to come together. And let's be honest, if they don't, they're largely toast in this legislative election. He believes that he might be able to do something with Les Républicains. They scored only 7% in the European elections last night. So he's thinking maybe that they might get, kind of drawn towards his orbit. And he hopes that really in a series of second round duels between his candidates on the majority and other kind of Republican parties, largely the Republicans, and the National Rally, that people would opt for the kind of the democratic side of things rather than the far right in those second round duels. But what a gamble this is. It's caught so many of his own MPs, his own deputies by surprise. And people are saying it's a terrible kind of decision. It looks really to be something quite difficult. Yael Braun-Pivet, who's the president of the National Assembly, of course, has been talking about the difficulties she's been having, trying to kind of build alliances to work across those party divides. Let's not forget, when looking at hung parliament at the moment, it's not been plain sailing for the majority. It's not been governing well, let's say. It's been forced to do deals on literally everything. Macron needed to call some kind of something because he's going to face a series of no confidence votes in trying to pass the budget for 2025. This had to happen at some point, but the speed at which this happens really making things difficult.
Andrew, if it doesn't quite work out for Emmanuel Macron, I mean, one suggestion that I've heard a few times is that if it doesn't work out, the far right do well. You finish up with Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella potentially as the prime minister working with Emmanuel Macron. They then have 3 years, which is really going to be difficult and maybe complete chaos, which means that in 3 years' time, when we come to the next presidential elections, it means that the far right is just as unpopular as everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the far right have enjoyed this parliament. They've been able to sit back in their armchairs, play wrecker, interrupt everything the government tries to do, and gain some kind of outer veneer of some kind of respectability as they kind of sit in parliament. And what this does is that Macron's trying to call them onto the electoral turf. But as you say, it's a big gamble. We look at polling just now. Some private polling says they could gain as much as 243 seats. They might well, gain hugely and become one of the largest parties. Bardella would likely be the candidate for the Matignon, reserving Marine Le Pen for the potential presidential elections in 2027. Bardella won't stand in the legislative elections because he's got a job as MEP to ignore in the meantime. But he would lead the charge, I think, for sure. And as you say, the hope is, the understanding is that Macron might hope that they would be sort of damaged by politics. They would be damaged, show their incompetence. We know that Bardella is better at TikTok than policy. But nonetheless, this seems to be a big gamble. They could, in power, really just pave the way with a couple of small giveaways to the base, something like the idea of déchéance nationale, like the nationalité, the idea of stripping people of nationality, something like ideas of national preference. They could give something there and limp along to 2027. It's not a long time for them to disgrace themselves over a parliament, to really weaken them before 2027. I think that is a really risky scenario. That isn't a gamble, that's Russian roulette.
Andrew, if it wasn't for France looking a bit wider now at the European elections, it would have been much duller in a way, wouldn't it? Because actually the far right didn't make those enormous gains that had been feared. There are exceptions, of course, in some countries where the far right did do better. But generally, it was much more of a calm result than was expected.
Absolutely. We used to say that the European elections don't change anything nationally. Well, clearly they have in France, But I think what you see is really the liberal centre has held in Brussels. The largest parties remain drawn around the idea of liberal democracy. The far right didn't proceed as it might have. Of course, you've got the two largest far right parties still remain pretty divided in terms of the actual overall kind of parliamentary groupings. You've got the European Conservatism and Reformists, that's the ones that Meloni sits in, and then the Identity and Democracy group, that's the ones that the Rassemblement National sit in, or don't, as the reality happens. But you've got this kind of division there in those. But some of the national results, of course, Germany didn't do too well. Olaf Scholz's party kind of fell back, the Socialists fell back, and we saw a kind of strong result for AfD. In Italy, Meloni's party it looks like it might have exceeded its national election vote share that it got just recently, which shows a kind of a confidence certainly in a prime minister kind of term, in a governorship. But the big one really will be in Hungary, where it looks like it looks like Viktor Orban really has a challenge on his hands. It looks like for the first time that Fidesz has a real challenge against it under Peter Magyar, formerly insider turned outsider, challenging and really gaining on that vote share. So it looks really like the danger from the far right is not in Brussels, not at the European level within that European Parliament, but instead in the kind of stronger member states, especially Germany and France, and obviously already Italy, where those parties have surged in response to this. Of course, we know that Jacques Chirac, when he called his snap legislative election, was looking to strengthen the hand in order to kind of push forward European reforms. What Macron might have done is get the same result, the cohabitation, but instead really weaken that idea of France's commitment to Europe by inviting in those that are fundamentally opposed to it, and instead looking to take that kind of divisive Russian line that we've seen the RN cleave to so often. So a big change in France, but not the biggest of changes in Brussels.
One change that you briefly mentioned there, of course, is Hungary. I mean, do you think Hungary's sort of rather been a thorn in the side, hasn't it, of European politics for the last few years, a bit like the British were before Brexit, of course. I mean, does this help the European Parliament, do you think, advance a little bit? Because if they haven't got Viktor Orban being able to breathe down their necks all the time?
It may well strengthen that hand. I mean, it's worth pointing out that, Orban's party still did relatively well. It didn't have perhaps the kind of, the thumping result it hoped for, but it still had a large percent of the vote share. Orban still claims that there were a couple of elections and he's won both of them. They were the kind of the larger in this, but they don't necessarily have the same sort of unanimity that they once had. And I think that sort of thing will be useful in terms of projecting the idea that there is kind of a democratic challenge going on in Hungary as well. And that helped promote the message of kind of European reformists, European centrists, that we can see, and the more kind of democratic wing of that moves away from perhaps the more nakedly kind of ethnic populist basis that we see that we've seen kind of pushed in Hungary as well. So yeah, it will be easier, I think, perhaps to move some European business without that threat coming from Hungary. But I think there will be a lot of people looking over their necks in France and in Germany at the kind of scores that have been kind of returned, at the polling results that have been returned last night for their own elections, which are kind of forthcoming very soon indeed. So perhaps things go more smoothly in Brussels, but I think those kind of storms in the member states will continue to kind of challenge some of the business that needs to be done in order to contribute to the European Parliament.
Finally, Andrew, let's end by coming back to France. Just a warning, are we going to record this answer and play it back to you in a couple of weeks' time, OK? Because I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your prediction? I know it's very difficult at this stage for what might happen over the next few weeks here in France.
I think everything depends on whether or not there can be a leftist unity before Friday. I don't think that's going to come out. Already Mélenchon's playing the wrecker. I think what will happen is that historians famously don't do predictions, so just stay with me on this one. I think what will likely happen is the Rassemblement National will massively increase their number of seats. I don't think they will have a governing majority. I think politics will be even more fractious. That will instead build their position for 2027. And I think this bet will largely backfire on Macron. I think it will put the far right on a stronger position for the presidential election to come in 27. I think it will make governing in the National Assembly more difficult in the interim. And I think what we're likely to see is more immobilism around this as well, more blockages, more difficulty in passing bills, and a lot more storms to come in the National Assembly before a very fractious election in 2027, which, remember, Emmanuel Macron cannot stand in. And there is no clear candidate who will replace him. Of course, Edouard Philippe, people like that, maybe look like contenders, but there is no automatic candidate who will replace Macron for the majority. It will be an unknown territory in 2027, and one in which I think the far right will have gained quite a lot from really this terrible gamble that Macron has played just now.
Andrew, good to talk to you on the programme today. Sorry about throwing that googly, to use a cricketing term, to you at the end there, but good to get your views. Andrew Smith joining us there from the University of London, the lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University. Thanks very much, of course.